Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds good. I'm not, wow, that's real hustling, getting that up.
All whole band.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
She was here doing all stuff.
Oh my God. How long are you here until?
I will leave 29th in the States. I'm planning to visit South Carolina for this conference.
South Carolina, that's where I grew up.
My sister's living here, so I'll go visit her and then I'll
Oh,
go
who's
back.
living there?
My sister.
Oh, okay. Where?
I'm in Charleston.
Oh my gosh, that's where I went to school, elementary and high school. Wow, okay. Have you been there before?
No, I haven't actually.
Yeah. Random. Yeah, I grew up right outside Charleston. It was North Charleston. It was sort of more diverse, more even a smaller population.
Okay.
Where did your sister live? Did she live in downtown?
No idea.
Oh, okay.
I'll just go there.
Yeah, the weather should be nice. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so.
I miss the food. The food is so wonderful.
Yeah, it's totally the
It's a
same.
cuisine of its own. You can't find it anywhere else in the United States. Local cuisine.
Here.
In South Carolina.
I'll be there until 27th, and then at 27th, and then I'll come back to New York, and then I have flight back to Kyrgyzstan. Yeah, and then after 7 days, I'm heading on to China for another conference and meetings with our partners there. No, it's in Xi'an. Yeah, the town of Xi'an.
Oh, Xi'an.
Xi'an and Urumqi as well.
Okay.
Well, lots of trips this year.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's so messy, jet lag, so time every year.
Yes, yes. But at least you don't have to do them back to back.
Yeah, it plays something else sometimes.
Oh yeah, yes, and the air in the airplane.
Yeah, that's right.
Like if you don't get to stretch your muscle,
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
you could have dire consequences. But the travel is important.
Yeah.
It's much better to do in-person meetings.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, when we usually meet our partners like in Eastern Europe, we go there personally. We solve all the issues like this. Then we have like 5-10 minutes conversation, and then whole day resting, visiting different restaurants. But yeah, just these 5-10 minutes, yeah, they're enough to tackle all the issues.
I guess it's different when you're in the U.S. in Washington D.C. because there are so many people who want to meet with you. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not.
You're right. But still, yeah, it's good. It's good. I enjoyed it a lot. Even though we had a busy schedule, it was productive week. Yeah.
That's good.
Always
That's
happy
great.
when I have productive weeks.
Oh,
Michael.
Hey, Michael. Hey.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yeah, for sure. And you found us okay?
Yeah, no
Okay,
problem.
good.
We did have a moment. This is my colleague Dennis.
Hi.
Who works on the
Nice
Asia
to meet you.
Hi, Michael.
I'm right. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. Dennis, right? We were walking up here, and she's like, "It's at Freedom House, right?" It's like, "There's HRSM are always over there," and I was like, "Oh." I just want to run to the restroom before we start.
Yeah, here's the key fob.
Okay.
And the bathroom is just outside on this floor. I think that's, yeah.
Okay, great. Am I having to sign the seat here?
We stuck you at the end.
All right.
Farthest away from me, Michael, you know.
Good.
Well, have a good time in Charleston.
Thank you.
I hope you make it to the beach. I'm such a beach bum. I always used to. I spent my summers. Not doing
Yeah, that's Actually, this is the first time in the USA. I've traveled almost all over the world. Yeah, USA it's good. I like it.
What are you doing in China?
In China, we're meeting our university partners.
Oh, okay.
I believe 3 universities. We're having meetings with rectors of that universities, and then we have, I believe, a conference. Yeah, that we're invited to as well. I'm going there as rector.
Oh, excellent! Wow.
Like principal. We don't call them principals. We call them rectors. So.
That should. I lived and worked in Beijing for almost 3 years, working on the criminal justice and legal aid. We had I'm trying to think. Wait, Xi'an is in the west, or Xi'an is in the north?
Somewhere in the center, like it's right in the middle of China.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there are a lot of cities with like almost the same name, just one letter different. Yeah, so there probably should be another change.
I'm thinking of where we had. I think we had an office in Xi'an working on juvenile.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a long time ago, though. Xi'an. I remember their
I haven't been there.
donkey burgers.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm surprised we don't have. If you need our internet password.
Yeah, that's fine. I just
Yes. That's a good question. Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Michael.
Let me ask Coco.
Oh, fantastic. Nice to meet you.
We're not able to.
Sorry, we've never met in Bishkek.
Yeah, I met a few times with your team there, and it was really interesting.
Oh, yeah, we're good.
Okay.
What
I
you
got
do,
it.
because we focus on legal issues only.
Right.
You're doing like a broader
Full cross section.
broader approach in this issue. So
Yeah. Great. No, I'm really glad to meet you. How long are you here for?
came for one.
So quick trip.
But yes, but other people from Kyrgyzstan, they have some difficulties, and I joined just for the delegation and to participate in this.
Okay.
Thank you for the chance to hear from you. And actually, the reports of
We are
the
1 week away.
search is the main source of data for everybody
Yeah,
in Kyrgyzstan and region.
1 week. It's taking a little while to get the, just doing it because it's peer reviewed, or adding like a Lucy has an editorial, so which is good. I mean, we legitimate you can do that. Release dates April 27th, so we're there. And we're doing an event in London on the 1st, and then I think
Yeah,
I know
let's,
everybody is anticipating this. We can do that.
Okay, so what do you want
Uh-oh. Oh, really?
Camera.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Welcome to our panel discussion entitled Migration and Violent Extremism in Eurasia, an Integrated Approach to Preventing Radicalization. My name is Jennifer Tsai. I'm a senior advisor at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, which is an international rule of law and human rights organization working for more than 25 years in more than 100 countries. Our mission is to promote justice, economic opportunity, and human dignity through the rule of law. Clearly, by sort of the name of our organization, we see the rule of law as a means to an end, a critical tool for solving global problems. And our topic today certainly fits the bill. On Tuesday of this week, we held our second annual Rule of Law conference, examining rule of law approaches to forced migration, people compelled to leave their communities because of conflict, persecution, or violations of human rights. Those who qualify as refugees under international or domestic laws. The focus was on forced migration in Central America, Africa, and Syria. Today's discussion is very much a continuation of the rich conversations we had on Tuesday. Our panelists will discuss migration outside the refugee realm in the non-refugee context. Specifically, they will focus on migrant workers in Central Asia, those individuals from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan who permanently or seasonally migrate for work to Russia and Kazakhstan in search of a better life, but often face alienation and xenophobia while living there. Many are re-entry banned or irregular migrants or returning migrants who face new and deepened vulnerabilities as a result of the economic downturn and re-entry bans in Russia. Our panelists will also look at what is resilience in the Central Asian context and how we might build programs around resilience as well as other strategies. They'll also touch upon what they have learned through their research, analysis, and programs about the links between labor, migration, and radicalization, the process of radicalization, for which there is very little analysis and research, and drivers of violent extremism among migrants in Central Asia. I'm very pleased to introduce our wonderful panelists. The biographies, the longer biographies are sort of provided in one-page summaries. So in the interest of time, I will just read out their names. To my immediate right is Ryan Gibson. He was with the U.S. Department of State Conflict and Stabilization Operations. He's a conflict and stabilization advisor. Kalmarat Ayaz Bayatov, senior legal advisor with ABA ROLI's Kyrgyzstan office. Kalmarat Zhangziev, he's our vice rector of international affairs, International University of Kyrgyzstan. And finally, Michael Shipler, all the way down there. He's a regional director of Asia programs at Search for Common Grounds. Today what I'd like to do is, rather than have a conventional panel of presentations followed by Q&A, I'd like to just have a conversation. And I'll kick off sort of with the first question and ask our panelists to keep their remarks to 5 to 7 minutes, followed by sort of a round of questions from me, and then we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for audience participation. So as I mentioned, our panelists have collected new qualitative evidence and observations on this topic that could help to inform policymakers and practitioners. Starting with you, Ryan, could you provide a brief overview of your research, of CSO's global research?
Absolutely. All right, everybody can hear me? Okay, so my name is Ryan Gibson. I'm, as was said, I'm with the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations in the Department of State. I'm an advisor and contractor, and so throughout this presentation, I'm going to be sharing my own findings and thinkings on the subject, and not representing the U.S. government in a formal capacity. So academics and NGOs have argued to varying degrees the severity of radicalization among Central Asian migrant populations. Some have suggested that this is an enormous challenge that needs to be addressed immediately. Others have said that this isn't something that we really should consider, and that it's that some of the risks are overblown by the other side. Academics have been able to demonstrate that about 80% of the individuals from Central Asia who are radicalizing are doing so in Russia. And so as a consequence, a number of these academics have been able to describe in pretty sophisticated terms how this radicalization process occurs and some of the risks that are affiliated with those populations. However, not as much research has been done to understand some of the vulnerabilities of returning Central Asian migrants and those living back within their home communities within Central Asia. So what I'm going to do is look at how CSO research fits into this story and how it can explain or not explain some of the trends we're seeing. So CSO research has identified a number of vulnerabilities that are positively correlated with a support for violent extremism or direct violence itself. 3 such vulnerabilities that are particularly relevant here include political marginalization, economic disenfranchisement, and social isolation. So I'm going to walk through those 3 quickly. For political marginalization, we here are concerned with an individual's perception of being marginalized. So in these terms, marginalization can entail anything from restrictions in religious freedoms and expression or restricted political voice. But the most important thing here is that we're examining what sort of perceptions that individual has and what sort of characteristics they feel they're being marginalized because of. So among Central Asian migrants, a number have expressed concern that they're treated while living in Russia as almost second-class citizens based on a number of characteristics from their ethnicity or their religion to their status as migrants. But the marginalization may not stop and be isolated to Russia. Many analysts, for example, have identified that Central Asians living back in their home community may face some of the same risks and perceive that they're being marginalized and that they don't have the protections that they feel they deserve. So there's the concern that violent extremist organizations may actually be able to tap into this and attract people because of these political grievances. The second major vulnerability is economic disenfranchisement. So CSO research has shown that there's actually not a strong positive correlation between poverty and violent extremism. So this is to say that just because an individual is poor doesn't mean that they're more likely to become a violent extremist. However, we have shown that if an individual perceives that they don't have economic opportunity, that they may be more willing to join, whether or not it's because of a financial motivation or because the group is able to tap into some sort of grievance that they're expressing. This could be relevant at multiple points. For many Central Asians who decide to migrate, they do so because of an economic motivation. And they may feel that there's a discontinuity between what they expected and what they actually have within their home communities. But once they get into Russia, they may find that they don't have the same opportunity that they expected or that the host communities are able to have. So there are multiple points where this could be relevant as a vulnerability. The third and final that I'm going to discuss is social isolation. So we've been able to see that networks play a very important role in pulling people both towards violent extremism and, as a resiliency, pull them away from violent extremism. So for these individuals, migrants who are transient and don't have necessarily a rooted, strong community, they may be more susceptible to and looking for community which may have an insidious kind of objective and goal. So CSO has been able to put this research together in a number of places. One that's relevant here is Afghanistan. And what we found is that despite all the vulnerabilities I just described, the migrant populations in Afghanistan are no more likely to join a violent extremist group or support that group than the host communities that they're living in. So I think this is a really pretty shocking finding, and it shows that when we're considering what's going on here, we can't just label somebody because they are of one category or another as at risk or vulnerable, but we should look at what those individual drivers are and how they may relate with an individual's overall vulnerability to radicalization. So,
Thank you, Ryan. And that's just a teaser of sort of what you'll say later regarding sort of linkages sort of between vulnerabilities, reduced resilience, and drivers of extremism. I'd like to sort of hop over to Michael and ask him, simply because we're taking sort of a global specific path to this conversation thread, and ask sort of you to respond to anything that Ryan mentioned, and also to talk about Search for Common Ground's new research on vulnerabilities as well as, I believe, resiliencies.
Yeah, absolutely. So good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Jenna, and thanks to ABA ROLI for organizing this. It's an important discussion, and always am heartened when we have a good group of people who are interested in this part of the world here in Washington come together. First of all, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Search for Common Ground, but I'll just say in a sort of a sentence who we are. We're a very practical, on-the-ground peace-building organization. So we do work. We have offices in 33 countries around the world focused on bringing people together from across dividing lines and addressing the transformation of institutions and social norms, ultimately with the objective of promoting collaboration and preventing violence. We have an office in Bishkek and have been working regionally across Central Asia, and been working for quite a long time around this issue of how, particularly in Kyrgyzstan, but regionally, how state authorities are responding to the perceived threat of violent extremism in the region. We've been working with security forces, youth leaders, civil society leaders, religious leaders, a whole broad cross-section of actors. And one of the things that comes is this sort of, and it's almost very often spoken almost as a point of obvious truth to people, although I think it may not be so clear-cut, but this notion that Central Asian migrants who are in Russia are more vulnerable to involvement in violent extremism than Central Asians living in Central Asia. You hear it all the time. It's kind of something that, and in this town, it gets said a lot. So we really wanted to understand, well, is this true? And you know, we also had some sense that there were some truths behind it, but that if we're going to address this particular dynamic, we really need to understand from Central Asian perspective what really is happening. And what are the key drivers and the dynamics that are affecting the ways in which people are experiencing the recruitment into violent extremism. And so, you know, from our perspective, we put this research together. While it's, I think, a very solid piece of research in terms of its academic rigor and policy rigor, we're looking for intervention points where we could actually make a change. And we're come to it from a very practical, programmatic perspective. And so we decided to go about it by bringing together partnership, an unusual partnership of organizations. First of all, doing research on the issue of radicalization and violent extremism in Russia is extremely difficult. In fact, almost nobody's really been able to access the populations and ask the kind of questions that we wanted to access and ask. The perceptions and the ideas and a lot of the research has been quite removed. And we really thought, how are we going to get into those communities, bring the rigor of analysis and research that we need, but also really value and honor the perspectives of people in their fullest manner. So we put together a partnership. We use what we call the common ground approach. We try to create unusual collaborations between people who are sometimes divided. And the partnership involved the Royal United Services Institute, which is really probably the most prominent critical think tank working on security and conflict issues in the United Kingdom, a major shaper of Western policy around all sorts of security issues. The Russian Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Oriental Studies, which is, of course, the Russian Academy of Sciences, likewise is, you know, a 130-year-old organization with huge influence over Russian government policy. And then a group of Central Asian researchers. teams mostly from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And by having this partnership, we were able to do a couple of things. First, we were able to access those communities where migrant workers are living, which was a huge challenge, which was really around negotiating that access with the Russian government and Russian authorities, particularly the migration services. The second was we were able to access migrant workers and create space for them to speak openly, honestly, and transparently about the dynamics that they are facing, the pressures and challenges in their experience. And then third, and for us most importantly, we were able to create a shared basis of understanding between the key Russian and key Western think tanks and institutions and policy influencers around what really is going on. And that, given all the tensions that bubbled to the surface in the last months, but have been underlying some of the global dynamics, is a really fundamental and critical thing to be doing, particularly in the context where there may be conflict, violence emerging. I can jump into some of the insights if that would be helpful in response, but I think I can jump in. There are kind of 3 insights and the other things I can share around the research. The study is coming out. All right. Sorry, there's no clock, so I didn't know about the time. So, first of all, there were 3 insights that emerged from this. First, that the baseline of incidence is rather low. There are not huge numbers of, people will use the term like hotbed of radicalization. It's not the case. Actually, most people who we interviewed didn't know very many people at all, if anybody, who had actually gone and joined ISIS in Syria. Secondly, that there's no really key typical profile of what a violent extremist person looks like. And this is really quite challenging because how do you intervene if there's no typical profile? People come from all sorts of different dynamics. A third insight for us was that came out of this question that people ask all the time: is radicalization happening in Russia or in Central Asia at home? And for us, this is a false dichotomy. People live complex lives that exist in multiple geographies simultaneously. There is no single place where a switch is being flipped. And to sort of treat it that way, first of all, cuts off all of our options and opportunities for intervention, but also denies the kind of individual life journey and life context that people go through that lead them into choices that they're making around joining extremist groups. What was most interesting for us is that what we also found was that there are a whole array of identified resiliency factors, institutions, and people that are functioning among Central Asian migrant communities. One thing that was there were 2 really particularly interesting things for me from this. One was that a lot of Central Asian migrants described a kind of mixture of experiences with Russian authorities and Russian security forces, and that there is a great deal actually of cooperation with migration services and others, and migrant worker leaders around addressing whole array of security and other kinds of concerns that are affecting migrant workers. And that actually is a resiliency factor. Since the St. Petersburg bombings in April 2017, there has been a bit of a shift. 17 was it? There has been a bit of a shift and sort of a securitization of that migrant worker space, but still the openness and collaboration existed. And the second major resiliency factor was the existence of a very mature and important set of community leaders among Central Asian migrants. Most powerfully, I thought the most insightful for me, were construction foremen. People who run construction sites or run construction crews, who are seen as father figures to migrant workers, particularly those who may be isolated and alone, and who are helping them to solve problems, solve challenges in their lives, helping them to deal with the interpersonal dynamics. And what those 2 things give us is some intervention points. And I'll stop there and we can talk about intervention opportunities as we go forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. And so, yes, want to talk sort of more about resiliencies. I think we don't talk about it enough, just the positive stories about migrants and their contributions to resilience. And this is all to counter sort of this narrative, predominant narrative as sort of migrants as sort of radicalized and terrorists. So research on vulnerabilities. Next, I want to turn to Ayaz to talk about sort of the particular vulnerabilities of returning migrants to Kyrgyzstan and what you see in terms of legal gaps, sort of socioeconomic problems, and then to Kamrat to end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Because of the time limits, I'll just try to be very short and
Yes, thank you.
focus on those issues I'd like to present. I just want to connect the information we received to the problems which exist in the legal sphere. On the example of Kyrgyz Republic, just to provide information for further discussion onto how concrete issues lead to the concrete legal problems. So I would just start by referring to what you said, that and I totally agree with the statement that there is no label, and we cannot say that someone is likely to be radicalized. And the same was said by you, that there is no typical profile, no location or moment to be radicalized, and it's all about life context. From the legal point of view, we must think about two issues. First is radicalization in minds, when people are ready to be radicalized in their minds, and the moment when they start doing something, so it goes to violent extremism. So these two issues are different, and for legal perspective, it's very important to understand what's between how the first thing is being created, and here we see those issues, economic, social, political marginalization, all this stuff. And the second is how these people start act. Here we see how government intervenes. And unfortunately, on the example of our countries, we cannot say that such intervention is effective, because that moment between the radicalized mindset and the actions as a violent extremist, something's happening there. And we have an influence from someone, from something. And the most important thing for lawyers in this regard to understand what kind of procedure should be used by the government and law enforcement and others to stop that moment, to oppose the process of connecting these two issues. So, of course, we, as a representative of ABA ROLI office in Kyrgyzstan, I must say that we work with defense attorneys, with judges, prosecutors, and we were able to see the situation from their side. And just to say, in general, what we heard much from everybody, and mostly from advocates, is a tendency when for some categories of cases, some due process are being ignored. So they say that despite all the numbers presented by authorities in regard to fighting violent extremism or attempts to do something, these numbers are not representative, since these are just the people who were arrested, and a big issue is about evidence they had to arrest these people. So what we have here, so we have the conclusion would be as this. First of all, radicalized mindset is a result of concrete issues, concrete problems that people face. As it was said, like migrants from Kyrgyzstan go to Russia, they often go from close religious communities, sometimes ethnic minorities. They go to Russia, they face huge economic, social pressure, many problems in this regard. They don't trust the authority, don't trust government. They have this feeling of being alienated, and they need the support. Then we have absolutely artificial phenomena of returning migrants. When we have hundreds of thousands of people who are migrants, and then they were just banned to enter the country. So they separated from the community. They in the Kyrgyzstan again, without money, with failed hopes, and sometimes separate with relatives. So, and they have problems in Kyrgyzstan again. I won't go into details right now. So in this regard, they become radicalized in their minds. They're ready to act. And now we have second situation when we have improper influence from someone who create that illegal behavior when they join or do some bad things, or leave to the territories where they can do that. In that regard, as a lawyers, we can say that the way how governments treat the situation is not maybe effective, since advocates say that the law enforcement can do two things in this regard. First is effectively stop that influence through social networks, through informal channels of communication, that's through networks of those people who spread these ideas of violent extremism. And second, to investigate concrete crimes and concrete people who did something wrong. In first regard, we do have lack of knowledge, lack of skills, lack of technology from governments in Central Asia. They cannot stop improper influence. From second side, when they investigate concrete crimes, we have a huge tendency of ignorance for due process, for all legitimate procedures to find evidence and to prosecute people. And thanks for your organization providing much of data. And one of the biggest problems we have in legal sphere is a lack of criteria for religious expertise, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan. I don't want to go to the details saying, oh, what kind of reasons are being used by law enforcement to say that someone is extremist or not, how they differ bad literature of okay literature. Nothing is being explored in this regard, and we cannot say that this kind of efforts has helped to stop the improper behavior, and on contrary, we can say that such legal response creates even more problems, and we see that people become less cooperative and trust less to authorities, and we see not just ineffective response, but also contribution to the problem. That's from the legal perspective, and I'll try to go into details when it will be necessary. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. So we heard about sort of low level of trust of institutions, and also how sort of institutions, states using sort of this security-focused approach, so maybe exacerbating sort of the problem that they're actually trying to counter. So Kalmar, please help us by understanding sort of the socioeconomic problems in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Michael, for the job you're doing in Bishkek and all the Central Asian countries. As Ayaz, my colleague, mentioned, there are several factors that actually affect and make people think radically, especially those who preach Islam. I'd like to mention two of them. The first one is financial difficulties. We should admit that the way radical organizations work is by helping people like lonely mothers, to giving them food or providing medicine, so they become more vulnerable for their influence. And the second one is social isolation. Muslims are often a socially isolated group in Central Asian countries, unlike in European countries. What increases not only the gap between Muslims and the rest of the population, but also makes them more psychologically vulnerable. One of the most vulnerable segment of the populations are students. In the period of personality formation, it's very important to receive complete and reliable information about the world that surrounds, and propaganda of radical Islamic ideas can affect the young person and cause irreparable damage. Based on the factors that we all mentioned, the International University of Kyrgyzstan, where I work as vice principal, in cooperation with Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan, we've been working on developing a practical tool that will prevent radicalization of migrants. To begin with, an organization was founded, a group of representatives of the Islam High Priesthood and the psychology professors from International University of Kyrgyzstan and Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan. And based on discuss, we found that the most fundamental practical way with minimum expenses would be establishing a new joint program in theology subject. Let me tell you about two main goals that we see. The first is a more practical goal. Since Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan issues not full graduate diplomas but certificates as madrasah, the graduates from that university are the diploma they gain doesn't help them to be competitive in the labor market. So cooperating with our university, we are able to give them two diplomas. The first one, diploma of International University of Kyrgyzstan, ours, and the second from Islamic University, which makes them more competitive in the labor market later on. The second goal is social integration. An active environment with constructive focus and the generation of new initiatives to solve social problems as well as training and the necessary technology to complete leads energy of young Muslims in the right directions and form social responsibility. Students should understand how to apply their knowledge and how to make decisions. Our task is not only to provide knowledge and skills, but also the ability to make decisions. We also instill the skills of self-organization, self-improvement, self-education, reflection, and many other factors. On the other hand, students of International University of Kyrgyzstan, knowing what the essence of education at the Islamic University is, and that helps them to communicate with the students and understand them more deeply. So basically, what we are doing, we're trying to help students from Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan integrate in society, and which will help them in the future when they become adults be less vulnerable for radicalization. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've all talked about sort of vulnerabilities, sort of in your own research and sort of in specific country contexts. But we still, I think, don't understand sort of the linkages between sort of these vulnerabilities and drivers of violent extremism and sort of that lead to radicalization. Wondering, and I think key to implementing effective CV strategies is a better understanding of sort of these real drivers in Russia and Central Asia. Wondering if you all can sort of dig a little bit deeper and talk about those linkages, and also how sort of what you understand and successful programming responses to violent extremism and sort of some of the challenges in that. And I think we'll start sort of with Kamarat and sort of work our way back to Ryan.
Excuse me again, do you want me to tell about the social and economic factors of radicalization?
And also sort of the role of sort of religious education in responding to in responding to sort of violent extremism, and how, I know your program has just started, but how you see this helping to reduce radicalization.
Mm-hmm. In the Kyrgyz Republic, the Islamic universities in all madrasah, they don't communicate a lot with Ministry of Education. They are mostly working with Islamic priesthood, which makes difficulties in understanding the nature of their education system. So what we're trying to do now is trying to integrate this whole Islamic education world into the legal frame where Ministry of Education will be able to evaluate the work and, well, actually, then they will see the information and there will be a source to work with in the future if we find any kinds of any bias and radicalizations.
Thank you. So education, the importance of sort of education curriculum, including sort of teachings on moderate Islam and sort of being able to identify sort of terrorist recruitment tactics.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. If you want me to tell, like in short, the way we're planning to work with the university is that we're planning to give secular education in the first and the second year for the students of Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan, so they can, at that time, they can integrate with our students who are like 30% of our students are foreigners, so they have a worldview. And then third and second year, they will study theological subjects at the Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan.
Okay.
So that's how we were going to work.
Thank you. And I sort of, coming from ABA ROLI, sort of you look at this through a rule of law lens, and just to inform all of you, we do have our May 2017 conference was focused on kind of CVE, rule of law approaches to CVE. So perhaps Ayaz, you can share with us some thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Of course, first of all, I'd like to tell about the shortly about the experience ABA ROLI had in this regard about the religious education. We implemented for, I don't remember what, for many years, a program which is called like street law. You know that program, but we connected law schools with madrasas. And the students were able to share the information with people in madrasas, and that's how we saw one of the ways to address the problem of isolation of the groups. So, and I think when you mentioned that groups are isolated, it looks very strange for Kyrgyzstan, which is a Muslim country, but in social life, in universities, people who wear religious clothes, they don't feel themselves as a part of the community, unfortunately. And in this regard, street law programs and this kind of initiatives are very necessary. But I must focus on legal issues mostly, and I want to make just a few comments on the, as you said, provide some details and dig deeper. First of all, as we said, radicalized mindset is a problem, and it comes from those vulnerabilities you mentioned, so I won't go to that sphere. About the technical issues, technical reasons about returning migrants. First of all, according to data you provided by International Organization of Migration and with help of USAID programs, the number huge of those who are not being returned to, who are banned to go to Russia, to return to Russia. And some people don't understand why this matters, why it's a problem, why people must be radicalized being in Kyrgyzstan more than those who hadn't lived Kyrgyzstan. For 2014, we had almost 200,000 migrants in blacklist of Russian Migration Service, almost 200. 2017, more than 100,000. Now people say around 80. We don't know exact number because different sources give a different number. The problem is that person in Russia as a migrant has more reasons to become angry with the authority and lose his trust than person in his own country because he has some maybe family support. We don't know, but less reasons to be angry. So that people who have more reasons to be angry banned to return the country. And the reason for that ban is a small technical administrative violations. Even like maybe driving could cause that ban. And you separated from the community, from the people, with that anger you had when you saw that abuses because of different issues, different ethnicity, all these issues. So that is a problem. Second, how they feel the support from the government and from judges, for instance. According to the data we have from different agencies, but just not focusing too much on Russia, saying about Kazakhstan, according to data we get from Committee on Human Rights under President of Kazakhstan for 2016, only 10% of migrants go to court when they see abuses of labor rights. Just 10%. And less than 1% are being go to appeal level. This means that they don't believe the judges, the governments. And in this regard, of course, banned migrants with that understanding that they have no trust, no support from the government, become easily radicalized.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds as sort of low levels of awareness of how to sort of defend yourself, sort of assert your rights around the reentry ban, and also sort of low trust of institutions, as we've heard.
Both contribute to those vulnerabilities mentioned by colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Michael, I want to go back to you about sort of resiliencies, sort of and building programs around that. Can you sort of elaborate on that and sort of provide other approaches that Search is looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the, within our research, as I mentioned, we were able to identify a number of key resiliency factors, and these, they're manifested in people actually, and in social relationships and networks. So we identified these number of different factors, and we're now building programming in response to this. But the identification of foremen, of informal community leaders is those two kind of key resiliency actors in a way form really the bulwark of where we need to be putting an investment of effort and energy. One of the key things is that, in Russia, there are actually appointed formal leaders who play a very formal liaison role with the government vis-a-vis all different kinds of migration and legal issues for the community. And those are not necessarily perceived by those in the community as being their key leaders. That is, those who emerge as more natural, informal leaders who are really critical. And so the resiliency kind of focused programming would do a couple of really specific things. One is to de-isolate those who are key in that strengthening community resiliency and social fabric. Second is to equip so they know who each other is and understand actually their role and responsibility vis-a-vis the community in relation to this particular issue. Because one of the findings is also that people who are in those roles are not necessarily equipped to manage the challenge of that individual young man who's tempted to join a violent extremist group and doesn't actually have the skills to understand or intervene. And so the second area is really around building out those skills and the skills structure, basically, and their knowledge of how to intervene effectively for people who are in that kind of a context. And then the third is around the social media and really looking at how we create connections between people who are migrants who may fit into that kind of vulnerability categories, and with those leaders in their communities and with their peers back home as well, who can help them to address the kind of array of individualized problems that they might face. One of the things I found really interesting about this was that the study was that the factor, we call it social isolation, the way that people talked about it was loneliness. The factor that was just, it was an overwhelming, if people say, this guy, he was lonely. We kind of hear this in this country too, with people who end up in various forms of extremist violence. And one of the really interesting points of research was that there's also cultural dynamics that shape how people experience their own individual isolation. And that Uzbek were more particularly vulnerable to that, having an adverse effect on them because of the actual cultural structure of society and the social networks and relationships that they have. Whereas the Kyrgyz, who are migrants, were a little bit less affected by that particular factor of loneliness, partly because they come from culture that it has a long tradition of being nomadic. And that was, I thought, a very particularly interesting factor. And so we're able to kind of get into this and look at how do we help people build out relationships and connections with each other, those who are playing key resiliency roles to be related to each other and form really more strong bonds, and then have the tools and knowledge to be able to play that role more powerfully and more effectively.
Thank you, Michael. And sort of turning to Ryan now, sort of a preventive approach, sort of looking at root causes. And sort of I'm going to add a question because you're going to start the next round. But sort of building on what Michael was saying, sort of the role of families, particularly mothers, in all of this, in countering and preventing violent extremism.
Yeah, great. So this is a pretty complex question to me about whether or not a vulnerability can transform into a driver and how these two things interact. I think, as others have suggested, I mean, it's a small number of the population that is actually radicalizing to violence. And I think somebody could satisfy each of the vulnerabilities. They could fall into each of these categories that I've described, and yet not join for one reason or another. And so I think this highlights how cultural, individual, and community level all of these forces interact with one another. I mean, so I think when we're evaluating this, though, as I said, this isn't a direct process, I think, and it's not also a consequence of the ideology itself. Here, two of the things that I think are key to in this interplay are this combination of potential vulnerabilities, potential drivers, and this networks that are being created and maintained. So I think this is the point where resiliency comes into play, because an individual who's experiencing a number of these challenges within their life may be disincentivized from joining a group if, for example, they are able to maintain a strong community and have support from within their social circles that are deterring them from joining this group. I think one last point about this. It's interesting. I think a lot of people talk about, in the Tajikistan case, for example, they talk about the number of remittances being sent back to Tajikistan as a potential vulnerability within the country, right? They talk about it as this economic fragility and a potential challenge. But I think that in a lot of ways, this is also an indication that the individuals are still connected with those communities back home, right? They're trying to provide and support their family, and they are able to maintain that connection. So I think, like I said, it's tough to answer. There isn't a direct path, but I think all of these things have to kind of come in together as a confluence to push somebody in that direction.
It's also sort of very highly localized.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, if you could comment on sort of not only of the role of families, but sort of more on sort of informal networks, diaspora, in sort of a role of countering radicalization. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I feel pretty good. So definitely, these networks are, like I said, critical for pulling people towards and away from it. I think diaspora communities can be, I'm concerned less about how the diaspora communities out in Russia, for example, relate to violent extremism than I am about the fact that these diaspora communities are connected back to their to the individuals at home and are able to maintain that connection. So I think that definitely networks are the most critical part here in understanding that transformation of instability into actual direct action and violence.
Michael, back to you.
Just respond. So I mean, I think that there are a couple of things. I think one of the things that's really interesting is about the question of religion that you brought up, and how religion is playing into this whole dynamic. There's kind of a common analysis you find in many places in the CVE literature that says that people who are attracted to go to Syria when ISIS was recruiting there were often religious novices, weren't people who were very religious in their lives. And that in Central Asia, this seems to be somewhat magnified. I mean, I'd be interested to hear if this perception is accurate, but this seems to be somewhat magnified. Being a post-communist environment where religion was not a big part of people's lives or was suppressed actively and continues to be suppressed in some of the Central Asian countries very fully. Basically with that as a dynamic, and a lot of young people emerging saying, I'm looking for an ideology, I'm looking for a set of ideas to belong to, and are very naturally being drawn to and curious about religion. And that what was happening in Russia is that in Russia, people have more access to internet and more access to religion, and more access to religious institutions, to mosques. And that is an enabling factor that makes somebody particularly vulnerable to being recruited by somebody who has designs on that, because they're easily duped and don't have necessarily the contextual background or the religious education that would enable them to say, well, actually, this is a real, not an interpretation of Islam that I believe in, because actually this doesn't fit into the other things that I've learned. And so I think this is really a critical thing, because if we're building interventions, one of the real critical intervention areas to me would be around protecting religious freedom across Central Asia, but also really enabling diverse interpretations of religion to be in the public sphere. And for people who have that curiosity to be able to access religious education that exposes them to that diverse set of ideas. So some of the social media work that we've done in Kyrgyzstan in particular focused on that, working with young clerics and others to be able to put into the social media space their interpretations of religion, and to try to create basically channels through social media where those young people who are curious in search of meaning and ideology may be able to find access to a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. The challenge is, of course, the legal environments in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are rather different from the legal environment in Kyrgyzstan for religious practice, and that and even with all the complications and challenges you described. So the legal space navigating it for actual implementation of programming is quite complex.
And then sort of the idea that sort of perhaps these informal networks are not in a position to provide the sort of legal protection and assistance that sort of a rights system necessarily would, and sort of if they bring sort of migrants more into the informal networks and allow migrants to hide more from institutions that they don't trust, then sort of you have this challenge with sort of these kinds of networks.
Well, but I mean, to me, the question is, if people can't practice religion openly, or there's suppression of religious freedom, well, then that puts religiosity under the ground, right? Which then actually creates vulnerabilities for people to be manipulating religion for ideological or violent extremist ends. So to me, the link between religious freedom, in addition to other basic rights, and the perpetuation of violent extremism is quite close in that sense. And I think this is a big debate that you know, I'm not from Kyrgyzstan, but this is a big debate that you hear in Kyrgyzstan, even among those in Department 10 and the police and in others, which is about how much religious freedom, you know, does religious freedom actually enable extremist ideologies to surface and have power and people to be recruited and manipulated, or does religious freedom actually create space for people to practice religion openly without being manipulated? And so there's a lot of discussion about this, and you see in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan a much more, a response which has been much more suppressive of religion and much more in line with the long-term traditions of post-Soviet environment. In Russia, there's a lot more space. People are able to practice the religion openly. And that was identified in particular as an enabling factor.
So it seems as if sort of these states, so without a more nuanced understanding of those linkages, and sort of these blanket bans and crackdowns on religious freedom sort of may be exacerbating the problem sort of more so. So
just to respond to that, I think what matters is around relationships, about how do those state security actors who have responsibility for preventing violent extremism, preventing terrorism, connect to religious leaders, clerics, and other sorts of community leaders around all the different dynamics, because they actually have the same problem and have much more in common than they have different. But what we have often in the region is a high level of distrust in both directions. And so the creation of collaborative platforms for people to be able to engage across those lines is a really critical thing, because you can actually, we know that the trust between security forces and communities, that's two-way, that's based on mutual collaboration and mutual respect, actually can create much more resiliency in communities to violence. And that's sort of a collaborative approach to this problem.
Kalmarat, do you want to respond to any of the comments thus far?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to mention just 2 points. First of all, I'm totally agree with Michael. There is a gap in ideology in former Soviet Union countries because of the previous strong ideology. Now we're looking for a national identification. And yeah, that could be one of the reasons why do some people go radicalized. The second point is that, well, actually, our personal opinion, those who work in the academia, due to why students or youngs go to Moscow or Russia for labor migration and then come somehow radicalized, is that actually when they go there, they feel lonely, they're more psychologically vulnerable, and actually there are lots of decentralized little mosques in Russian cities, which called flat mosques, where they gather and then they share their ideas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Ayaz.
In general, of course, it's very interesting to think about cultural structures, families, diaspora roles, and of course, they can play a big, an important role in this regard. I think when people get support from diaspora, I think it's also a big issue for them, and it helps them to feel them not restricted. But since my focus was a bit legal, I would just try to connect to this to the issue, my response to the issue of marginalization, because plus to the reasons we're discussing now, we still have a point when people start feel themselves, as you said, restricted. I used previously the word like angry. I think it's maybe not correct word, but I just remembered how you named that. It was perception, and it's a really good indication of how they feel. They perceive themselves as restricted, as a people who are out of legal system, and in all regards, social, economic, because if you have no protection, you cannot get any kind of benefits. And in that regard, of course, it leads to distrust and to all ongoing issues.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to sort of open it up to the audience. Please have your questions ready. Raise your hand and I'll walk over with a mic. Or do we have somebody to play this role? I'm happy to play this role. Linda and then Kat. And we'll take 3 questions and then just have panelists respond.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the panelists for interesting remarks. I have a pretty simple question, but it's the kind of simple question that can sort of telescope out into all sorts of complexity. And that is, we're sitting here in Washington and we're doing excellent academic research, and it is really interesting research, and it's completely valid, and I appreciate it. But my question is, what do you, in your view, in your experience, what do you think the people on the ground, the populations in Central Asia, how did they identify this problem? We're using the terms radicalization and extremism, a turn to violence. Do the populations in these regions think of it that way? Do they use that terminology, and do they see it as a threat to them and their communities? Or is it something that seems more logical, like they're so upset at their lack of services or their disaffection from the government that they can actually sympathize even if they themselves would not turn to violence? So what are the dynamics really down at the community level in terms of the terminology, the sense of the threat of what's going on, and are terms like extremism and radicalization government terms or Western terms that they see as coming from the outside, which would be dangerous, not for research, which I think is still interesting and valid, but dangerous in terms of designing programs that use those terms?
I think mine's related. It's about some of the measurement questions that come along with doing research and then a program based on that. And I'm wondering what you think people in different parts of Kyrgyzstan might think what would a citizen think a good metric is for a successful CVE program? I know it depends to some extent on what the program entails, what the design is, but what do you think when people look at society now and then they're going to compare it to whatever it's like at the end of a program, what would be a good measure in a Kyrgyz citizen's head about things are better? Or worse.
Yeah. Thank you. Questions about citizen perceptions, terminology, metrics. One more question. Announce yourself and your name.
Casey Johnson, State Department. I have a sort of a similar tag-on question to that. Not what the population thinks, but what do the states think? I mean, we use Central Asia as a shorthand in conversations like this, but how are state views evolving? How are state views different? You know, in other contexts where we attempt to do CVE work, where we're dealing with a strong state, sometimes they can start to see violent extremism everywhere, and it becomes a very easy tool for them to use. And when we look to implement programs, sometimes we go along with that because we're excited to be able to implement programs, and it quickly becomes something else. So I'm very interested, how do states view violent extremism? How is it different from state to state in the Central Asia region? How's it evolving?
Thank you. All excellent questions. Who wants to go first? Brian.
All right. So I think I can speak probably best to the first question. You know, when we were doing field assessments, we went out to Tajikistan, and it was interesting because when we met with locals, it really depended on where we were and who we were talking to as the way that they described or saw the problem. I remember multiple interactions where I would be speaking with somebody who was in the police or with the government, and it was interesting because there was this duality. It was almost like there wasn't violent extremism, but there was an interest in cooperation on counterterrorism and other challenges, right? So I think that when interacting with Western states, there seems to be a willingness to utilize the language that is used in the West, right? But I think that they may envision the problem a little bit differently. I think that's getting to Casey's question a bit, but I think I would be interested in hearing how others see that. As for the locals, it was interesting because there was almost an implicit assumption among those living in northern Tajikistan that the problem was inherently community-based, if I remember correctly. That if the community itself was vulnerable, then we would have a problem. But if it wasn't and it was tight and close-knit, then we didn't have a problem. Whereas in the south, the locals felt like it was a problem deriving from domestic violence, which was something that we hadn't heard anywhere else in Tajikistan. And it was interesting because I think the assumption was if somebody is willing to and uses violence in their homes, then they may be willing to use violence elsewhere. So I think, I mean, this is just one small case from Tajikistan, but it shows that I think depending on where you're interacting with and who you're interacting with, they're definitely describing the problem differently. And if we are unwilling to work with those populations and respond to those populations in a way that makes sense to them, then I think that programming is going to be a lot less effective than it could be otherwise.
Just small addition to the first answer or question. As I mentioned before, there is no the particular structure of madrasas and all educational institutions who teach Islam. So overall, there is no in the society there is no certain view of what kind of Islam is the right, and that's why there's the population they don't understand, because at the beginning they're all the same, but then it goes with it in a different ways, which one of them is definitely radicalized. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. We have a few questions about the threat. If society considers this as a threat, yes, definitely. And in that regard, of course, support for the governments comes from society. And the second issue, how governments perceive the threat, and in that regard, you said that about the language. Our governments do like the language which being used here, but not always go into the content of the words. For instance, radicalization, extremism are equalized to terrorism mostly. Not as a phenomenon, as a process, but terrorists, maybe not today, but tomorrow the terrorists. That's how they perceive. And we see this problem in regards of many words. For instance, trafficking in person. It's also everybody ready to cooperate, but don't understand what it means in reality, how to fight this. And for Central Asia, I think we all know how people understand and is this being created? And about effective CV program, it's a very difficult question. I would say you can spend, make many so my answer will be, it depends on whom we're talking. If we talk about advocates, they tell about due process, that people must be protected even for these cases. If we talk to society and police, they say like cases of terrorism, potential terrorism should be investigated effectively, not on the paper, but effectively. If we talk to judges, lawyers, they will say like we need criteria for religious expertise. So it depends on whom we talk. We don't have universal, unified criteria for effectiveness of CV program.
So thanks. These are all wonderful questions. You know, when our report's released, you'll see that actually the essence of this study is about capturing perceptions among Central Asian migrant workers about this issue. There are lots of kind of spaces in here where we give voice to people's own words and language around it. What I have found is that, yeah, I mean, there is a perceived threat, both among state actors and among the population. Where I personally have spent the most time is with young people in the Fergana Valley, where, you know, again, it's one of those places where people talk about a hotbed of radicalization, but where young people face a whole broad array of challenges in their lives, family challenges, work challenges, you know, the educational access challenges, a struggle to have a role and voice in determining the course of events in their society, in their communities, et cetera, a lack of space for participation. There's a generation with many challenges, and the challenge of young people, as people would often say, going to Syria, you know, is among them. And among the youth who I spoke a lot with, you know, for them, what they were interested in was their own participation, and looking at, you know, what role can we play in this community, in this society that would be constructive and powerful and would be perceived by adults and elders as having value. This in the Fergana Valley in Kyrgyzstan, you know, this is a big challenge, particularly among Uzbeks, and particularly for young Uzbek women, for instance, to kind of, you know, create this space with their own families to be able to actively engage and play a constructive role. And so there's a whole kind of exercise that needs to happen, both in terms of equipping youth to organize, supporting those who are organizing, not allowing that to be sort of an elite-driven exercise, but also then equipping adults to support those youth who want to play constructive, positive roles in the social, economic, and political fabric of their communities. And this was something, now that's not the language that, you know, a 18-year-old local activist uses, but that is underneath a lot of what is driving a lot of youth behaviors there. The other piece that, you know, this question about how states are responding. So, you know, the states, of course, like, you know, none of the states are monolithic, of course, and there's a whole array of actors. So if you speak with the colonels in, you know, Department 10, which is the key counterterrorism and religion unit of the police in all of the states in Central Asia, HS Department 10, you know, they're going to perceive the issues and dynamics in one way, and, you know, through a security and a legal framework. If you speak to the Muftiat, you're going to find a different kind of perception. The Muftiat in most countries is quite, you know, linked to the government. If you speak to, you know, the Office on Religious Affairs, the President's office in Kyrgyzstan, you have a different perception. And so, in fact, like many societies, you actually have a fractured sense of how to respond to what I would call perceived threat. Sometimes I think the threat of violent extremism is outsized in everyone's imagination, and it's not that it's this idea that there exist, you know, hotbeds of radicalization doesn't always pan out. The thing is, the consequences of violent extremism are outsized, and that's why it creates such a big place, and it's quite a useful political tool all over the world. And what we find is quite fractured states and people who are not actually engaged in conversation or speaking with one another about how they can actually effectively and collaboratively respond to those perceived threats in ways that address those root causes. I think that there's you know, from our perspective, and I know we're not unique in this analysis, but from our perspective, the lack of really very deep relationships among the Central Asian states and the lack of very effective security cooperation among the security agencies in the region leaves open some vulnerabilities and a gap. And that is a space that a number of groups, including us, are working on seeking to bridge. But there's also a lot of will, and a lot of will among, particularly among civil society leaders, religious leaders, but also among people within the security forces to build relationships and sort of attract to space and to identify ways of collaborating effectively to address these threats, but in constructive ways. And that creates a really big opportunity, I think, regionally, to have a very positive and constructive effect.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll take another round of 3 questions. Please raise your hand. And announce your name.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I am currently interning with ROLI's Asia department. So you guys talked a little bit about like loneliness and people feeling disconnected from their communities and that adding to the rise to violent extremism. And I was wondering what role maybe like gender roles play in that. I'm assuming that most of these migrants are men, and if it has anything to do with maybe a lack of the traditional families of getting married and having children and coming home to that, if that has anything to do with their like turn to violent extremism.
So gender as a vulnerability.
Janice Freeman, Search for Common Ground. My question's for Ryan, and I'd just be keen to hear more about the methodology of your research, kind of like what were, you know, some of like your key questions you were asking interviewees, what was kind of the scope of your research, and just hearing a little more about what went into that.
Great. Question for CSO. One last question. Maybe we can take another one.
Lisa Canessa from the State Department. I have a question for Michael and for Kalmarat. It's specific to religion. Michael, you mentioned that in Russia there was a little bit more space for religious practice. My question is, are the migrants allowed into the space? Or is it elitist? Because typically what I've seen in the north is that Tatars often run the official mosques. So other groups are driven into garage or flat mosques. So I'm curious if you noticed any inclusiveness in the more official channels. And I'm interested what you have to say about that, Kalmarat, because of the madrasa school process. How are you recruiting people into the school who might be interested?
Thank you very much. And we'll take one more.
Hi, my name is Maria Smith, also from the State Department. I'm interested, apologies if I missed this, I had to be a little bit late, but I'm interested in your thoughts on potential reintegration of people coming back from Iraq and Syria. My understanding has been there hasn't been a lot of people that have come back so far. I don't know if there are numbers or if you know, but if governments and communities both are sort of willing and prepared to accept people back.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you want to go ahead and start, Michael?
Me first? All right. On the gender issues, I think that, first of all, not all the migrants in Russia are men. You know, men and women are both migrating. People migrate sometimes in families, sometimes they're separated from their families. Sometimes, so you have a really diverse and array of setups that people live in. The loneliness surely is emerging from people who are more often separated from their families, and that is more likely to be young men. One of the dynamics around the loneliness, which I mean, I'd be interested to know, you know, what percentage of people on the blacklist are men versus women. I'm assuming that it's probably a predominantly male list. One of the things that I heard and came up often is that people on the blacklist or who know they're going to be on the blacklist are stuck in Russia. They can't go home because and I'm not. This is one of those issues which perpetuates loneliness. There's no movement back. But I just think that we also have identified in Central Asia as a really clear resiliency factor. So this is a little bit less the migrant question. But are the women clerics, the Atincha, who play a really clear, critical role within their communities of educating people around religion. And the power of building relationships between them and the array of stakeholders and constituents who play a role in this whole sphere around religious-based conflict is really vital. And we've put quite a lot of effort onto this, really particularly focused on building relationship between women who are in that religious space and the police at the local level, and police who are doing counterterrorism work. And in fact, we had a really powerful story around this where we invited a group of women to participate in a dialogue with a colonel from the Department 10 who had come to the Fergana Valley for a visit. And the women reported to us later that when we got the invitation to come, they had tearful goodbyes with their families, packed their bags because they thought they were being arrested. And when they came and found the colonel saying, "Tell me about your life. I want to understand what's going on. What are the challenges you're facing?" They were blown away. They had never had any kind of space to engage. And so it's really critical to understand that resiliency factor. And it's not women as resiliency factors, it's about women who are playing a particular role. I would like to defer on this question about the structure of religious access in Russia to my colleagues who might know much more about that than me. So if that's okay.
Thank you for questions, and I'd like to start about gender. I don't remember the exact number of proportion of females and males in the blacklist. Sorry, so I skipped the gender question. But there are researchers specifically focused on the role of a woman in the migrant movement. I don't want to just repeat those issues. You can find it online. There are some researchers which specifically focus on this issue. But I want to say about reintegration. We do have problems in in our economy. We do have problems in many regards. And if we say about reintegration in economic aspect, we do have problems even for the population which are not migrants. So, of course, they are not reintegrated as professionals, lawyers. So reintegration problem is a problem for those who are banned to return to the country as migrants. Because in this regard, we have many tendencies of the perception, of feelings, of failed hopes, of no financial support. And for those people, it would be necessary to have such program, at least helping them to prepare documents to go out of that list, etc. For May 2017, we had more than 100,000 people in blacklist. For 6 million countries, huge amount. Every fifth or sixth migrant in the blacklist. And again, the number is very different. And people sometimes don't know how is they still in blacklist or not. They just go there with that fear, and they just realize they're in the blacklist and just send back. Sometimes they illegally get new passport with new names. So reintegration for those who banned to return to country of their work. This is a big issue. Unfortunately, our state now focus on those migrants who are abroad the country, and the phenomenon of returned migrants is being ignored in many regards. And of course, since our government, they consider only those ways of solutions which require much of money, and they don't see other ways to work with them. Yeah, that's the answer. And saying about, I think this is it.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the questions. So first, I'll touch on the gender question. Thinking less about how gender relates to Central Asian migrants, but more about how gender relates to violent extremism. We've seen that both men and women can play instrumental roles in the radicalization of people and in perpetrating acts of violence. And many from the research that we've done, many of violent extremist groups are able to and utilize a description of masculinity and femininity, this kind of like appeal to these particular norms as a way to try and attract people. They'll say, you can accomplish what you want as a man or as a woman if you come to us, and it's framed as a form of empowerment, right? So that was just a little bit on gender. The second thing about methodology, so the foundation for our research on these vulnerabilities and violent extremism was based on a global large-scale quantitative data set first. So we identified which variables were statistically correlated with a number of different manifestations of VE. Some had to do with support for violence, some had to do with actually using direct violence, some had to do with growth or emergence of a violent extremist organization. So throughout my research, throughout this evaluation, I was considering mostly the variables that were related to support for VEOs, rather than, like, for example, the emergence of a violent extremist group. As for what I was doing, I was looking at how this quantitative data set works. It relates to the predominant literature on Central Asian migrants. So I was using sources like, for example, IOM, the report that was referenced earlier, IOM's report on Central Asian migrants as a base for evaluating what our quantitative data says and how that could relate. As for future analysis, we're planning actually on diving into how vulnerabilities differ within Tajikistan specifically on a community basis. And that research, which we plan on instituting over the next couple years, we will have to develop specific survey questions and actually have an implementer go out into the field to conduct this research and kind of confirm that the literature review plus quantitative thinking matches with what actually people are perceiving on the ground. And then lastly, for reintegration, I think there's a tension within the state to maintain security, but also reintegrate these people. I think recently there was a report that Tajikistan, for example, had granted amnesty to quite a large number of I'm referring to the reintegration of returnees, violent extremist returnees, not migrants themselves. But Tajikistan, for example, granted amnesty to a pretty substantial portion of the population. And I think this may signify in certain ways kind of a willingness to reintegrate the individuals, not just, let's say, like lock them up because of their security risk or pose some other risks. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Answering the first question, we, as International University of Kyrgyzstan, we don't recruit students for Islam education, so we don't prepare imams or other religion services, unless we're talking about a theology program that we run in our Eastern Studies department, and they are more specialists in theology rather than in the religion. And what we do, actually, we cooperate with Islamic University of Kyrgyzstan, which has different status with madrasahs. This university prepare again specialists in theology field, and madrasahs, they prepare mostly imams and other religious services. Did I answer your question?
And in Russia, how are people accessing religion in Russia?
Yeah.
That's a question, like how much informal space versus informal.
Yeah, so that's why I was like raising hand, because
yes.
Well, from the reports we do have, and especially legal reports, we don't have indications that there are huge problems with the interventions to how people practice religion in Russia. So in that regard, practicing religion is not a big problem, I would say, because with no indication for this, like systematic abuse and violations. When we say about human rights and legal protection, we say about usual life of people, how they, if they're a member of the society, if they have access to legal protection and legal support if necessary. Not about religion as such, but in general, their rights. And the main difference between response from government side in our countries and in Russia is that in Russia, of course, the technological and other mechanisms are much stronger and advanced, and this allows to more effectively control the improper influence through social networks, etc. Of course, that's a difference, but no indication that there are problems with practicing law. I think this is how we can answer the question.
Well, we have come to the end of our 90 minutes. I want to thank all of you for your participation today. I couldn't have wished for a better panel of experts, so please join me in thanking them for their comments. Thank you so much. And please feel free to continue these conversations even after the formal discussion ends. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, no. Yeah, and it seemed like a lot of the questions that to the list for us. Yeah, isn't that remarkable?
I was impressed by what you had among our
The 6 that you see.
No. Yeah.
Actually,
We were 2 in and
doing research, right?
I hope so.
I mean, we
Your
mostly
colleagues
do
were-
direct.
Yeah, no, so much better coming from the audience.
But we did this.
Yeah.
Next week will be released.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I hope we run into each
Very
other.
good.
Yes, thanks,
Next
Sean.
week, give me your card.
Oh, unfortunately, I brought this week was so.
Thanks, Travis. Excellent job.
I totally lost track of time at the beginning. And then he slipped the sign next to me. And when I didn't notice it, I'm like, blah, 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 blah. And then I looked down when I finished. I was like, there it is.
Which one? I read all
this
this
one.
paper. Although it's
always useful.
And yes, have a good time in Charleston, South Carolina.
yeah, thank you very
I'll
much.
see you. Yeah.